grease and cheap bleach. That was the smell of Maeve's life at 1:58 a.m. When the diner bell chimed, letting in a rush of freezing October wind and 4 men wearing suits too expensive for this zip code, anyone else would have frozen. The man in the center had eyes like dead flint, and he owned the pavement outside. Maeve just looked at the clunky wall clock. It was exactly 2 o'clock. She untied her apron, punched her card, and walked right past him. Grease gets under your fingernails in a way that soap can never quite fix. Maeve sat on a wobbly stool behind the counter, absent-mindedly scraping at her left thumbnail with a plastic coffee stirrer. The diner was a pocket of purgatory, tucked beneath the elevated train tracks, kept alive by flickering neon and the continuous hum of the commercial refrigerator. It smelled heavily of burnt onions, wet wool, and the bitter acidity of coffee that had been sitting on the burner for 5 hours. Her lower back throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache. 10 hours on feet, encased in cheap, non-slip shoes with worn-out soles. Every step felt like walking on bruised bone. She didn't want a better life right now. She didn't want a millionaire or a revolution or an epiphany. She just wanted to take her shoes off. Above the pie case, the analog clock clicked forward. 1:55 a.m. 5 minutes. To her left, a trucker in a stained denim jacket was snoring gently into his crossed arms, his half-eaten plate of eggs congealing into a yellow paste. Sal, the line cook, was aggressively scraping the grill in the back, the harsh metallic shk-shk cutting through the low volume of the radio playing some forgotten jazz tune. Maeve let out a slow, shallow breath. The air tasted stale. She reached into her apron pocket, her fingers brushing against a handful of crumpled dollar bills and sticky quarters. $9 in tips tonight, enough to buy a decent pack of painkillers and maybe a stale bagel from the bodega on the corner. 1:57 a.m. She stood up, ignoring the sharp protest in her calves, and began wiping down the counter with a damp rag that smelled heavily of industrial sanitizer. She wasn't really cleaning. She was just moving dirt from one side of the laminate to the other. It was the performance of working necessary to satisfy the cameras blinking in the corners. Then the bell above the glass door violently chimed. A sharp blast of freezing autumn air invaded the diner, instantly killing the stifling warmth of the grill. Maeve didn't look up immediately. She was focused on a particularly stubborn ring of dried coffee. The silence that followed was heavy, unnatural. The radio kept playing, but the ambient noise of the diner, the rustling, the snoring, even Sal's frantic scraping, just died. It was the kind of sudden, suffocating quiet that happens when a predator steps onto the feeding grounds. Maeve finally dragged her eyes up from the counter. 4 men had walked in. They brought the outside in with them, the smell of ozone, cold asphalt, and something metallic and sharp that tasted like copper at the back of the throat. Blood. Fresh blood. 3 of them were massive, built like brick walls, draped in dark, tailored wool. Their hands were thick, their eyes constantly scanning the corners, the exits, the sleeping trucker. But it was the man in the center who anchored the room. He wasn't exceptionally tall, but he took up space like a physical weight. He wore a dark grey overcoat, unbuttoned, revealing a ruined silk tie, and a white shirt stained with a violent slash of crimson near the ribs. His face was a study in hard, brutal angles, marred by a freshly split lip and a bruise blooming across his left cheekbone. His dark eyes were flat, dead. They swept over the diner with clinical detachment before locking on to Maeve. Roman. The neighborhood didn't say his name out loud, but everyone knew his face. He owned the clubs on the south side, the docks on the east, and allegedly the politicians in between. When men like him walked into places like this, somebody was usually about to die. Sal made a pathetic, choking sound from the kitchen window. The snoring trucker suddenly woke up, took one look at the door, and turned entirely to stone, pressing his face toward the wall. Roman took a slow step forward. His leather shoes made a deliberate, heavy sound against the sticky linoleum. The 3 mountains of muscle fanned out behind him, silently securing the diner. One locked the front door. Another pulled the blinds. They were turning the diner into a cage. Roman walked toward the counter, toward Maeve's section. He stopped directly across from her, separating them only by 2 feet of scratched laminate. He didn't speak. He just looked at her. His breathing slow and steady, his eyes demanding the usual reaction. The fear, the trembling, the desperate stammering offers to cook whatever he wanted, to give him the register, to beg for a quiet night. Maeve looked at his chest. She saw the blood on his shirt. She smelled the gunpowder clinging to his coat, mixing with expensive woody cologne. Then she looked past him, up at the wall. The minute hand snapped into place. 2 a.m. A heavy, absolute exhaustion washed over her, drowning out whatever survival instinct she was supposed to be feeling. Her feet were screaming. Her head felt like it was stuffed with wet cotton. She was off the clock. If she died right now, at least, she wouldn't have to open tomorrow at noon. Without breaking eye contact with the wall clock, Maeve reached behind her and grabbed her time card. She slid it into the heavy metal slot. K-chunk. The sound was louder than a gunshot in the silent diner. Roman blinked. Once. Slowly. A microscopic fracture in his stony composure. Maeve reached behind her waist deftly, untying the strings of her stained apron. She pulled it over her head, balling it up and tossing it onto the counter next to Roman's hand. She reached under the counter, pulled out her battered woolen coat, and slipped her arms into the sleeves. She didn't look at his face. She didn't look at his men. She walked out from behind the counter. Roman was standing directly in the narrow aisle that led to the side exit. He was blocking the path, a solid mass of muscle and violence. Maeve didn't stop. She didn't slow down. She kept her head down, her shoulders slumped, and walked straight forward. As she reached him, she turned her shoulder just a fraction of an inch, brushing heavily against his expensive wool coat. The contact was solid, real. She pushed past the Mafia boss, squeezing through the narrow gap between him and a vinyl booth. "Excuse me," she muttered, her voice completely flat, raspy from disuse. She walked to the side door, pushed the heavy crash bar, and stepped out into the freezing night alley. The door swung shut behind her with a heavy, final thud, leaving the deadliest men in the city standing in absolute bewildered silence. The heavy click of the metal door latch echoed off the greasy walls of Ray's diner. Inside, the silence stretched out taut and fragile, like piano wire pulled to the breaking point. Roman stood exactly where she had left him, his broad shoulders squared, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. He was staring at the space Maeve had occupied a second ago. He could still feel the phantom pressure of her cheap woolen coat sliding against his arm. "Excuse me." It wasn't a plea. It wasn't a panicked squeak. It was the dull, irritated mumble of a commuter pushing past a stranger on a crowded subway. Behind him, Leo, a man who had broken kneecaps with a tire iron less than 40 minutes ago, let out a sharp, incredulous breath. He took a heavy step forward, his hand instinctively dropping toward the bulge beneath his tailored jacket. "Boss!" Leo growled, his voice a low rumble of offended violence. "You want I should go drag her back in here by her hair? Nobody disrespects." Roman raised a single-gloved hand. 2 fingers lifted, a universal command for silence. Leo snapped his mouth shut, freezing mid-step. The other 2 men remained utterly still, their eyes locked on Roman's back, waiting for the explosion. They had just survived a botched ambush at the shipyards. The adrenaline was still thick in their blood, making them twitchy, desperate to break something. But Roman didn't explode. He slowly turned his head, looking down at the crumpled, stain-covered apron lying on the counter. He reached out the leather of his glove, creaking slightly in the quiet diner, and touched the fabric. It was slightly damp. It smelled like bleach and cheap cherry pie. A strange, unfamiliar sensation rippled through his chest. It wasn't anger. Anger was hot and loud. This was cold, clinical, and intensely sharp. It was absolute bewilderment. For the past 15 years, Roman had operated on a simple, immutable law of physics. His presence warped reality. People saw him, and their fundamental nature changed. Brave men became cowards. Honest men became liars. Women either threw themselves at him or shrank away in terror. He was the apex predator in a concrete jungle, and everyone around him was acutely aware of their place on the food chain. Except for the waitress with the bruised eyes and the cheap shoes, she had looked at the blood on his shirt, looked at the killers flanking him, and decided that her shift being over was the most pressing issue in the room. Roman turned toward the kitchen window. Sal was pressed flat against the stainless steel refrigerator, his face the color of spoiled milk, trembling so hard the ladles hanging above his head were vibrating. "Coffee," Roman said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that barely carried over the hum of the fridge. "Black." Sal nearly tripped over his own feet, rushing to the coffee pot. He poured a mug with shaking hands, spilling hot liquid over the sides, and shoved it onto the counter. Roman didn't sit. He took a sip of the scalding, bitter liquid. It tasted like burnt dirt. It was perfect. "What's her name?" Roman asked, his eyes never leaving the side door. Sal swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing frantically. Maeve. Just Maeve. She's nobody, Mr. Rossi. Just a girl. Works the graveyard. She ain't quite right in the head, you know, a little slow." Sal tapped his temple, nervously, trying to offer an excuse for the disrespect. Roman slowly turned his gaze to the cook. The dead flat look in his eyes made Sal instantly regret speaking. "She isn't slow," Roman said softly, placing the mug back on the counter. "She's just tired." He reached into his pocket, pulled out a crisp folded $100 bill, and dropped it onto the spilled coffee on the counter. He turned and walked toward the side exit. His men parted instantly, letting him pass. Roman pushed the crash bar and stepped out into the biting October wind. The alley was dark, littered with overflowing dumpsters and broken pallets. A stray cat darted into the shadows. Down the street at the very edge of the orange glow, cast by a flickering street lamp, he saw her. Maeve. She was walking slowly, her shoulders hunched against the bitter wind. She wasn't running. She wasn't looking back over her shoulder to see if she was being followed. Her steps were uneven, a heavy, dragging gait that spoke of deep, bone-deep exhaustion. The cold air hit her face like tiny razors. Maeve pulled her collar up, burying her chin in the scratchy wool. Her toes were numb, but her arches still burned with a fiery ache. Her heart wasn't racing. That was the strangest part, she thought idly, as she kicked a crushed beer can out of her path. She knew who she had just shoved past. She knew the stories. Roman Rossi had once allegedly curb-stomped a rival boss in broad daylight and walked away without a single witness brave enough to testify. She knew she had probably just signed her own death warrant. But as she turned the corner onto her bleak, trash-strewn street, she found she simply couldn't summon the energy to panic. Panic required calories. Panic required adrenaline, and her adrenal glands had burned out somewhere around Thursday of last week, right after her landlord handed her the eviction notice. If Rossi sent his goons to shoot her in the back of the head right now, at least she wouldn't have to worry about rent on Tuesday. She reached the stoop of her apartment building. The security door's glass had been spider-webbed by a brick a month ago and never fixed. The hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and stale cigarette smoke. She fumbled with her keys, her fingers stiff from the cold, and finally managed to unlock the front door. She trudged up 3 flights of stairs, the wood groaning under her weight. Every step was a negotiation with gravity. When she finally reached apartment 3B, she let herself in, locked the deadbolt, and leaned back against the cheap wood. She slid down until she was sitting on the dirty linoleum floor of her entryway. Slowly, methodically, she reached down and untied her left shoe. She pulled it off, wincing as the swollen joint of her big toe protested. Then the right. She sat there in the dark, the faint siren of a police car wailing 3 blocks over, rubbing her cold, aching feet. She thought about the flat, dead eyes of the man in the diner. Stupid, she told herself. You should have just stayed behind the counter. But the thought lacked conviction. She rested her head back against the door, closed her eyes, and let the darkness take her completely unaware of the black sedan that had just parked across the street, idling quietly in the shadows beneath her window. Morning tasted like old pennies and unbrushed teeth. Maeve peeled her right cheek off the hallway linoleum, a sharp spasm gripping her neck the moment she moved. She had fallen asleep with her back against the front door, her coat still halfway on. Dust motes danced lazily in the thin shaft of grey light filtering through the peephole. She pushed herself up her knees, popping loudly in the quiet apartment. The ambient temperature inside was barely warmer than the hallway. The radiator in the corner hissed sporadically, spitting out tepid drops of rusty water, but offering no real heat. Maeve shuffled to the narrow bathroom, flipping the light switch. The bulb flickered, buzzed like an angry hornet, and finally stabilized into a sickly yellow glare. She leaned over the chipped porcelain sink and turned the faucet. The pipes groaned deep within the walls before coughing up a stream of freezing water. She splashed it onto her face, gasping as the icy shock cut through the lingering fog of exhaustion. Looking in the mirror was a mistake she made every day. Dark, bruised-looking bags hung heavy under her pale blue eyes. Her skin was sallow, completely devoid of sunlight. She looked exactly like what she was, a 24-year-old woman, slowly being ground down to fine powder by the friction of living. A sharp, aggressive knock hammered against her front door. Maeve froze, the towel pressed against her dripping face. The events of last night, the blood, the silence, the flat, dead eyes of Roman Rossi rushed back into her conscious mind, hitting her stomach like a lead weight. Had he actually sent someone? Was a man in a tailored suit standing in her hallway, waiting to put a bullet through the cheap veneer of her door? Maeve, I know you're in there. I can hear the pipes. The voice was raspy, thick with decades of cheap cigars. It wasn't a hitman. It was Mr. Henderson, her landlord. She let out a breath she didn't know she was holding, her shoulders dropping 2 inches. Dropping the towel, she walked back to the entryway and undid the deadbolt, opening the door a crack. Henderson stood there, a stained undershirt stretching over his protruding belly, a clipboard in his meaty hand. He smelled faintly of stale beer and mold. "Tuesday, Maeve," he growled, not bothering with a greeting. "You said you'd have the rest of the rent by Tuesday. It's Tuesday." "It's Tuesday morning, Mr. Henderson," she replied, her voice rough, a dry scrape against her vocal cords. "I have the afternoon shift today. I'll get an advance from Ray. I'll slip it under your door tonight." Henderson's small, watery eyes narrowed. He looked her up and down, noting the wrinkled clothes and the bare, swollen feet standing on the cold floor. "Ray's a cheap bastard, and you're already behind. If I don't have $300 in cash by 8 o'clock tonight, I'm changing the locks. I got a guy willing to pay $50 more a month for this box. Tonight? Maeve repeated her expression, entirely blank. She didn't plead. Pleading was a waste of oxygen. 8 o'clock. She closed the door in his face and slid the deadbolt home. Leaning her forehead against the cool wood, she closed her eyes. $300. Ray would never front her $300. He might give her $50 if she promised to work a double on Sunday. She had $9 in tips from last night. Her bank account was overdrawn by 14. The math didn't work. It never worked. Across town, in a penthouse suite, overlooking the steel-grey chop of the river, Roman Rossi sat perfectly still in a leather armchair. The room smelled of expensive leather lemon polish and the faint, coppery tang of the blood that had soaked through his shirt the night before. He was freshly showered. A doctor on his payroll had come at 3 in the morning to stitch the knife wound along his ribs. It pulled sharply with every breath, a tight, burning reminder of the shipyard. But Roman wasn't thinking about the ambush. He wasn't thinking about the men he needed to bury or the territory he needed to secure. He was staring at the pristine glass of his coffee table. His mind kept replaying a singular absurd loop of footage. A waitress looking at the clock, the heavy ka-chunk of the time card, the smell of bleach, the blunt physical contact of her shoulder hitting his as she pushed past him. "Excuse me." Leo stood in the doorway of the office, shifting uncomfortably from foot to foot. He had a fresh bandage wrapped around his knuckles. "Boss, the cars are ready. We need to go down to the docks, clean up the mess from last night before the uniforms get too nosy." Roman didn't blink. He slowly uncrossed his legs and stood up, ignoring the flare of pain in his side. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking down at the crawling traffic of the city. Millions of people. Millions of insects scurrying around, terrified of being stepped on. "Leo," Roman said quietly, his breath fogging the glass slightly. "Yeah, boss. Cancel the dock run. Send Marco to handle it." Roman turned around, his dark eyes snapping into sharp, terrifying focus. "Bring the car around. We're going to get lunch." Leo frowned, a thick line of confusion appearing on his forehead. "Lunch, boss, with respect. Half the Moretti crew is probably looking for us, and you want to sit down for a steak." "Not a steak," Roman murmured, walking past his enforcer and grabbing a dark cashmere coat from the rack. "I want a cherry pie." From Ray's. Midday at Ray's diner was loud wet and smelled intensely of frying oil and burnt meatloaf. The lunch rush was a chaotic scramble of construction workers, exhausted nurses from the clinic down the block, and retirees nursing bottomless cups of decaf. Maeve was drowning in it. Sweat beaded at her hairline, gluing stray strands of dull brown hair to her forehead. She balanced 3 heavy porcelain plates along her left arm, ignoring the sharp pain radiating from her wrist as she maneuvered through the narrow aisles. "Order up, Maeve, move it!" Sal screamed from the kitchen window, slamming his hand down on the metal bell. Ding, ding, ding. "I hear you, Sal, I'm not deaf," she muttered, sliding a plate of overly battered fish in front of a guy reading a newspaper. "Enjoy." She turned back toward the counter, grabbing a damp rag to wipe down a newly vacated booth. The laminate was sticky with spilled syrup from breakfast. As she scrubbed, a sudden heavy hush rolled over the front half of the diner. It didn't happen all at once. It was a cascading wave of silence, starting at the door and spreading inward, swallowing the clatter of silverware and the low hum of conversation. Maeve paused, her hand gripping the dirty rag. She recognized that silence. She slowly stood up straight and turned around. Roman Rossi was standing inside the doorway. Daylight did not soften him. If anything, the harsh, unforgiving fluorescent lights of the diner highlighted the brutal architecture of his face. The bruise on his cheekbone was a dark, ugly purple now. He wore a perfectly tailored black suit, no tie, the collar of his crisp white shirt unbuttoned to reveal the smooth skin of his throat. He looked entirely out of place, a wolf stepping onto a carousel. Outside the glass windows, a sleek black town car idled at the curb. Leo was leaning against the fender, smoking a cigarette, his eyes scanning the street. Roman had come alone. He didn't scan the room. He didn't need to. He looked straight at Maeve. Maeve's heart gave a dull, tired flutter against her ribs. She didn't feel terror. She felt an overwhelming, crushing wave of irritation. She had 3 tables waiting for checks. Sal was burning the grilled cheeses, and now she had to deal with the Mafia boss, who was apparently obsessed with her workplace. Roman began walking toward her. The patrons in the booths shrank back against the vinyl, trying to make themselves invisible. He stopped at the booth she had just finished wiping. He looked at the cracked red vinyl seat, then at Maeve. Without a word, he slid into the booth, sitting perfectly straight, his large hands resting flat on the table. Maeve stared at him. He stared back. 10 seconds passed. The diner remained breathlessly quiet. "Can I get you a menu?" Maeve finally asked, her voice flat, deliberately devoid of whatever deference he was used to hearing. "Black coffee," Roman said. His voice was a physical rumble in the quiet space. "And a slice of cherry pie." "We're out of cherry." Roman tilted his head slightly, a microscopic adjustment. "Apple, then." "Apple's stale. It's from yesterday." "I don't care." Maeve stared at him for another long second. She let out a short, quiet breath through her nose, a clear sign of annoyance, and turned on her heel. She walked to the counter, grabbed a thick mug, and poured it full of the sludge bubbling on the back burner. She plated a sad, collapsed slice of apple pie and walked back to his booth. She set the mug down first. Some of the black liquid sloshed over the rim, staining the paper placemat. She didn't apologize. She slid the pie next to it and dropped a rolled-up set of silverware onto the table. "Anything else?" she asked, pulling her order pad from her apron. Roman didn't look at the food. He was looking at her hands. He noticed the red, cracked skin around her knuckles. He noticed the slight tremor in her fingers, the way she shifted her weight from one swollen foot to the other. "Sit down," Roman commanded quietly. Maeve stopped writing on her pad. She looked up at his face. The dead, flinty eyes were intensely focused on her. "I'm working," she said. "Sit." It wasn't louder, but the weight behind the word increased exponentially. "No." A collective gasp echoed from a nearby booth. The nurse sitting there looked like she was about to faint. Roman's jaw tightened. A muscle ticked rapidly just beneath his ear. Nobody said no to him. Politicians didn't say no. Rival bosses didn't say no. This exhausted girl in a stained apron smelling of grease and cheap soap was looking him dead in the eye and refusing a direct order. "I have 3 tables waiting for their checks." Maeve continued her tone, conversational, as if she were explaining arithmetic to a slow child. "Sal is burning a patty melt. My shift doesn't end for another 4 hours. I don't have time to sit and play whatever game this is." Roman reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. The movement was smooth, practiced. Half the diner flinched, expecting a gun. Instead, he pulled out a thick, folded stack of $100 bills. It was easily a few $1,000s. He dropped it onto the table right next to the stale pie. "By the diner's time," Roman said flatly. "Sit down." Maeve looked at the money. It was more cash than she had seen in her entire life. It was rent, groceries, new shoes, a heating bill. It was freedom wrapped in a rubber band, sitting next to a spilled cup of coffee. She looked from the money to Roman's face. She didn't reach for the cash. Instead, she reached out and wiped a smudge of grease off the edge of the table with her rag. "I don't accept tips over 20% without management approval." She lied smoothly, her voice completely deadpan. "Enjoy your pie." She turned around and walked away, leaving Roman Rossi sitting in a greasy booth, staring at a stack of rejected cash and a waitress who simply refused to bend. Roman stayed in the booth for exactly 23 minutes. He didn't touch the coffee. He didn't touch the stale apple pie. He just sat perfectly still, his dark eyes tracking Maeve as she navigated the lunch rush. She felt the weight of his stare like a physical pressure against her spine. It made the fine hairs on the nape of her neck stand up, prickling beneath her sweat-damp collar. She ignored it. She carried heavy trays of meatloaf, refilled plastic water pitchers, and wiped down sticky tables with a rag that was rapidly turning a questionable shade of grey. Every time she passed his booth, the ambient temperature seemed to drop a few degrees, but she never turned her head. At exactly 1:15, Roman stood up. The movement was silent fluid and deeply out of place among the clattering dishes and scraping chairs. He buttoned his dark coat over the blood-stained shirt, gave Maeve one final unreadable look, and walked out the glass door. The bell chimed happily. The Blacktown car swallowed him whole and pulled away from the curb, blending into the sluggish afternoon traffic. On the table, sitting in a puddle of spilled black coffee, was the thick stack of $100 bills. Maeve walked over a bus tub balanced on her hip. She picked up the untouched pie and the full mug, tossing them unceremoniously into the plastic tub. She didn't touch the cash. Holy Mother of God, the voice belonged to Ray. The diner's owner had emerged from his tiny windowless office in the back, drawn by the sudden, terrified hush that had fallen over the dining room during Roman's visit. Ray was a short, aggressively balding man who perpetually smelled of cheap drugstore aftershave and nervous sweat. He was staring at the table, his eyes practically bulging out of his skull. "Don't touch it, Ray," Maeve said tiredly, spraying the laminate with a heavy dose of industrial sanitizer. "Are you insane?" Ray hissed, his hands trembling as he hovered them over the stack. "Do you know who that was? That was Roman Rossi. He just left." "Jesus, Maeve, that's got to be $5,000. Why did he leave $5,000? He wanted me to sit down. I told him I was working." Ray looked at her as if she had just confessed to murder. "You told Roman Rossi?" "No, I'm on the clock, Ray." Maeve aggressively scrubbed at a dried ketchup stain. "If I sit down, you dock my pay. You've done it twice this month." Ray stammered, entirely lost for words. He reached out and grabbed the damp stack of bills, clutching them to his chest like a newborn infant. "I'm putting this in the safe, for liability." "Yeah, liability." Maeve stopped scrubbing. She leaned her weight against the edge of the table, her worn-out shoes squeaking slightly on the linoleum. "Put it wherever you want. But I need an advance on next week's pay. $50. Ray blinked, still high on the sudden influx of thousands of dollars. "An advance, Maeve, I can't just—" "You just pocketed $5,000 of Mafia hush money, Ray. Give me $50, or I walk out right now, and you can run the dinner rush by yourself." Her voice wasn't raised. It was flat hollow and utterly serious. Ray swallowed hard, looking from the small fortune in his hands to the dead exhaustion in Maeve's eyes. He fumbled in his apron pocket, pulled out a crumpled $50 bill, and slapped it onto the wet table. "You're opening tomorrow," he muttered, turning and scurrying back toward his office before she could demand more. Maeve picked up the damp bill, folding it carefully into her apron pocket, alongside her miserable $9 in tips. $59. The rest of the shift was a blur of aching joints and screaming muscles. By the time 7 o'clock rolled around the sky outside, The greasy windows was a deep, bruising purple. The temperature had plummeted, turning the puddles in the gutters into slick sheets of black ice. Maeve punched her time card. Ka-chunk. She stripped off the sour-smelling apron, threw on her threadbare woolen coat, and pushed out the side door into the biting wind. The walk home was agonizing. The cold gnawed right through her thin denim jeans, settling deep into her bones. Her right big toe throbbed in time with her heartbeat, a sharp, stabbing pain that made her limp slightly. She kept her head down her hands, buried deep in her pockets, clutching the $59. $300. Henderson wanted $300 by 8 o'clock. She turned the corner onto her street. The street lamp was still flickering, casting sickly yellow spasms of light across the overflowing dumpsters. She approached the front door of her building, fully dreading the next 10 minutes. She was going to have to stand in the hallway, humiliate herself, and beg a man who smelled like mold to give her 3 more days. She pulled open the heavy glass-shattered door. The familiar stench of boiled cabbage ammonia and old cigarette smoke hit her like a physical wall. Henderson's apartment was 1A right on the ground floor, next to the rattling radiator. Maeve walked down the narrow hall, her wet shoes squeaking softly. She stopped in front of the door. The cheap veneer was peeling at the bottom. She closed her eyes, took a deep, rattling breath of the foul air, and raised her knuckles to the wood. She knocked 3 times, sharp, polite, pathetic. She waited. A heavy thud sounded from inside, followed by a low, frantic scraping noise. The deadbolt clicked, sticking halfway, then aggressively snapping open. The door swung inward. Henderson stood there. He wasn't wearing his usual stained undershirt. He had thrown a wrinkled dress shirt over his large frame, buttoned incorrectly. His face was the color of wet ash. He was sweating profusely thick beads, rolling down his jowls, and his eyes were wide, darting frantically between Maeve and the hallway behind her. "Mr. Henderson!" Maeve started, her voice hoarse. "I have $59. I get paid on Friday. I just need—" "It's fine," Henderson interrupted his voice, a choked, wheezing gasp. He physically shrank back from the doorway, pulling the door wider. "It's all fine. Paid in full. Don't worry about it." Maeve frowned, her hand tightening around the crumpled bills in her pocket. "What do you mean, paid in full? I just told you I only have—" She stopped. Through the open doorway past Henderson's trembling shoulder, she saw the inside of his living room. The ugly floral-patterned recliner had been pushed back against the wall. Sitting on Henderson's lumpy, flea-bitten sofa was Roman Rossi. The visual dissonance was staggering. Roman sat on a sofa, covered in cigarette burns and mysterious dark stains. His dark-tailored trousers were perfectly creased. His black wool coat was draped over his broad shoulders, pristine and immaculate against the squalor of Henderson's living room. He looked entirely relaxed, one ankle resting on his opposite knee, his large gloved hands clasped loosely in his lap. Standing in the corner of the small room blocking the only window was the mountain of muscle from the diner. Leo. He was chewing on a toothpick, looking at Henderson, with the kind of mild, detached interest a butcher gives a side of beef. The apartment smelled intensely of fear. It was a sharp, acidic scent, completely overpowering the usual stale beer and mold. It was radiating off Henderson in waves. Maeve stood frozen in the hallway. Her hand, still buried in her pocket, slowly released its death grip on the $59. "Mr. Henderson," Roman said. His voice was a low, smooth rumble that vibrated through the cheap drywall. He didn't look at the landlord. He was looking directly at Maeve. "I believe we are finished." Henderson flinched as if he had been struck. "Yes, sir. Absolutely, Mr. Rossi. Paid in full. 6 months in advance. She don't got to worry about a thing." He practically fell over himself, trying to edge out of the doorway, pressing his sweaty back against the hallway wall to give Maeve a wide berth. Maeve didn't move. She stared at Roman, her chest tightening. It wasn't relief that flooded her system. It was a cold, sharp spike of violation. She had spent the last 3 years guarding her miserable, pathetic independence with everything she had. She took the extra shifts she endured, the burns and the aching bones, all to avoid owing anyone anything. In her world, favors were currency, and debt was a chain around your neck. Roman uncrossed his legs and stood up. The sofa groaned in relief. He walked toward the doorway, his leather shoes clicking deliberately against the cheap, peeling linoleum. Henderson squeezed his eyes shut as Roman passed him. Roman stopped in the doorway, looming over Maeve. The top of her head barely reached his collarbone. Up close, the smell of his expensive woody cologne completely erased the stench of the hallway. It was suffocating. 6 months, Roman said, quietly looking down at her. You have 6 months of quiet. He expected a reaction. Tears, perhaps. Stunned gratitude. A stammering confession of thanks. He had just erased the largest, most terrifying variable in her existence with a fraction of what he carried in his pocket. Maeve tilted her head back to look at his face. The bruise on his cheekbone was a dark, venomous yellow at the edges now. I didn't ask you to do that, she said. Her voice was utterly devoid of warmth. It was a flat, scraped sound. Roman's eyes narrowed by a fraction of a millimeter. The muscle beneath his ear ticked. No, you didn't. I don't know you. Maeve kept her eyes locked on his, refusing to let the sheer physical mass of the man intimidate her. I don't want your money, and I don't want your favors. Whatever this is, whatever weird, twisted charity project you've decided I am, find someone else. Leo let out a low, dangerous growl from the corner of the room, taking a heavy step forward. Boss, you want me to teach her some manners? Roman raised a single-gloved hand, silencing the enforcer without looking away from Maeve. Leave, he commanded. Leo stopped, utterly bewildered, but he didn't argue. He squeezed past Roman, shoving Henderson roughly into the wall as he exited into the hallway and marched out the front door into the freezing night. Roman and Maeve were left standing in the doorway mere inches apart. The cold draft from the hallway ruffled the collar of his coat. It wasn't charity, Roman said softly, his voice dropping an octave, becoming a private, dangerous sound, meant only for her. Then what was it? Maeve snapped, a sudden hot flash of anger finally burning through her exhaustion. You came into my diner, bled all over the floor, threw thousands of dollars at me, and now you're sitting in my landlord's disgusting apartment paying my rent. What do you want? I want you to stop walking past me. The words hung in the stale air, heavy and loaded with an intense, terrifying gravity. Roman wasn't posturing. It was a simple, absolute statement of fact. For 24 hours, the memory of her brushing past his shoulder, completely indifferent to the violence that surrounded him, had been a splinter under his skin. It demanded resolution. Maeve let out a short, cynical bark of a laugh. It hurt her dry throat. That's it. Your ego is so fragile that you have to buy my life, because I didn't wet myself when you walked in to raise... Roman's jaw tightened. He stepped forward, closing the final inch of distance between them. Maeve didn't back up. She planted her aching feet firmly on the linoleum. He was so close, she could feel the heat radiating off his chest, feel the slight rhythmic pull of his breath against the air between them. He looked down at her pale, exhausted face, taking in the dark bruises under her eyes, the chapped, raw skin of her lips. She was a ruin, a fragile, shattered thing held together by cheap coffee and spite. Yet standing here blocking her path, he felt a strange, magnetic pull that defied all logic. Slowly, deliberately, Roman reached out. Maeve tensed her muscles, locking up, expecting a blow or a grab. But he didn't touch her face or her throat. He reached down and caught the edge of her unbuttoned woolen coat, pulling it firmly across her chest to block out the freezing hallway draft. His knuckles briefly accidentally brushed against the fabric over her collarbone. The contact was electric, a sudden spark of heat in the freezing corridor. 6 months, Maeve, Roman murmured, his dark eyes burning into hers. Sleep. He let go of her coat, stepped around her, and walked down the hallway. He pushed open the heavy front door and disappeared into the October night, leaving Maeve standing alone in the suffocating silence, her heart suddenly violently hammering against her ribs. Exhaustion didn't rock her to sleep. It dragged her under. When Maeve finally collapsed onto her unmade mattress, fully clothed, her body simply shut down. For the first time in 3 years, the constant low-grade hum of financial terror that usually kept her hovering on the edge of consciousness was gone. She woke up 14 hours later. The apartment was suffocatingly hot. Maeve peeled her cheek off the scratchy polyester pillowcase, coughing dryly. The radiator in the corner, which had been a rusted, useless piece of iron since she moved in, was hissing, violently pumping waves of dry, aggressive heat into the small room. Henderson must have fixed it. He must have called a guy the second Roman left the building, terrified that the Mafia boss would return and find his new investment shivering. Maeve sat up and her body screamed. Adrenaline and panic had been acting as a structural adhesive for her joints. Without them, every muscle fiber felt bruised, every tendon stretched to its absolute limit. She swung her legs over the edge of the mattress, wincing as her bare feet hit the warm linoleum. She walked to the kitchen, poured a glass of tap water, and downed it in one long, painful swallow. Her mind felt terrifyingly blank. No mental arithmetic, no calculating how many tips she needed to avoid eviction. Roman Rossi had effectively amputated her survival instinct with a stack of $100 bills. It didn't feel like freedom. It felt like a cage with a suddenly open door. She didn't trust the space outside. By the time she walked into Ray's diner for her Friday evening shift, the temperature outside had dropped another 10 degrees, but she was sweating beneath her coat. The bell chimed. The smell of frying onions and bleach hit her nostrils. Something was wrong. Ray was standing behind the register, wiping down the laminate with manic intensity. When he saw Maeve, he dropped the rag. He didn't yell at her for being 2 minutes late. He didn't complain about the lunch rush. He just stared at her, his throat bobbing as he swallowed hard. "Hey, Maeve." Ray squeaked his voice, an octave higher than usual. "You want a coffee before you clock in on the house?" Maeve stopped halfway to the back room. Ray hadn't offered a free coffee in the history of the diner. Even water required a polite request. She looked past him to the grill. Sal was meticulously flipping burgers, completely silent. The radio was off. The usual chaotic banter was dead. "I'm fine, Ray," Maeve said, her voice raspy. She walked to the back, punched her card, and tied her stained apron around her waist. The shift was a waking nightmare. It wasn't the physical labor that was the same grueling marathon of carrying heavy plates and wiping dirty tables. It was the atmosphere. The regulars, the construction workers, and the weary nurses didn't make eye contact with her. When she dropped off a check, they left a $20 bill and scrambled out the door without asking for change. She had become radioactive. They all knew. In a neighborhood like this, news of a man like Roman Rossi sitting in a greasy booth and dropping thousands of dollars on a waitress traveled faster than a grease fire. They didn't see Maeve anymore. They saw Rossi's property. By 2 a.m., her apron pockets were heavy with unearned, terrified tips, and her jaw ached from clenching it. She clocked out. Ka-chunk. She pushed through the side door into the freezing alley, expecting the usual bite of the October wind. Instead, she almost walked straight into a solid wall of dark wool. Maeve stumbled back, her heart performing a violent, painful stutter against her ribs. It wasn't Roman. It was the other one, the massive enforcer who had been ready to break her neck in Henderson's apartment. Leo. He was leaning against the brick wall, blowing a thick cloud of cigarette smoke into the cold air. A sleek black sedan idled silently at the mouth of the alley. Leo didn't move aggressively. He just looked down at her, his expression a mixture of profound annoyance and mild disbelief. He reached into his coat pocket. Maeve braced herself, her muscles locking up. Leo pulled out a plain brown paper bag and held it out. "Take it." He grunted, his voice a gravelly rumble. Maeve stared at the bag. She didn't move her hands. "What is it?" "Take it, or I have to stand out here in the freezing cold until you do. And I really don't want to do that." Leo pushed the bag closer, lightly tapping it against her chest. Reluctantly, slowly, Maeve raised her hands and took the bag. It wasn't heavy. Leo immediately dropped his cigarette, crushed it beneath his expensive leather shoe, and walked toward the idling car. He didn't say another word. The heavy car door slammed shut, and the sedan glided away, leaving Maeve alone in the flickering light of the alley. She looked down at the brown paper. Her fingers were trembling slightly, not from the cold, but from a sudden sharp spike of anger. She ripped the top of the bag open. Inside was a small, heavy cardboard box and a white plastic pharmacy bottle. She pulled the box out first. Orthopedic gel insoles. Maximum support for standing shifts. She stared at the clinical blue lettering. Then she pulled out the plastic bottle. It was a prescription-grade muscle relaxant. No name on the label, just the pills. Roman hadn't bought her a diamond necklace. He hadn't bought her a dress. He had watched her limp. He had noticed the way she shifted her weight, the way her shoulders knotted under her cheap coat. He had diagnosed her exhaustion and unilaterally decided to medicate it. It was the most invasive, terrifyingly intimate thing anyone had ever done to her. Maeve crushed the paper bag in her fist. The sharp crinkle echoed in the empty alley. He was stripping away her struggle piece by piece, building a padded cell around her, without ever asking if she wanted to be locked inside. "No," Maeve whispered to the empty alley. She shoved the insoles and the pills deep into her coat pockets, turned on her heel, and walked toward the street. She wasn't going home to her newly heated, paid-for apartment. The docks smelled of diesel fuel, rotting kelp, and rusted iron. The wind coming off the black water was vicious, carrying tiny, sharp droplets of freezing spray that bit into Maeve's cheeks. It was 3:15 a.m. Ray, trembling and sweating, had given up the location of Rossi's import warehouse after only 30 seconds of Maeve standing silently in front of his office door. She walked past stacks of towering, corrugated shipping containers, her worn shoes slipping occasionally on patches of black ice. At the end of Pier 44 sat a massive warehouse, its corrugated metal walls glowing under the harsh glare of industrial floodlights. Two men in dark coats stood outside the heavy steel pedestrian door. One was smoking, the other was casually tossing a heavy metal bolt between his gloved hands. As Maeve approached, they stopped. They squared their shoulders, their hands instinctively moving toward their waistbands. "Lost, sweetheart?" the smoker asked, his voice dripping with casual menace. "Ain't nothing down here for you." Maeve stopped 5 feet away. She didn't shrink under their stares. She pulled her hands out of her pockets. "I'm looking for Roman Rossi." The men exchanged a look. It wasn't amusement. It was genuine, baffled surprise. People didn't just walk up to Pier 44 at 3 in the morning and ask for the boss. "Who's asking?" the second man demanded, stepping forward, his mass blocking the door. "Tell him it's Maeve, from the diner." The smoker frowned, pulling a radio from his coat. He muttered something into it, too low for her to hear. Static crackled in the cold air. A long, heavy silence followed. Maeve could hear the water slapping against the wooden pilings beneath them. The radio clicked. A single sharp word came through the speaker. The smoker slowly lowered the radio, looking at Maeve as if she had suddenly grown a second head. He reached out and pulled the heavy steel door open, gesturing with a tilt of his chin. "Go on up." The glass office on the catwalk. Maeve stepped past him. The inside of the warehouse was cavernous and surprisingly warm. It smelled of motor oil, raw tobacco, and expensive leather. High-end luxury cars, Maseratis, vintage Porsches, sleek black sedans were parked in precise geometric rows across the concrete floor. A metal staircase led up to a grated catwalk that ran the length of the building. At the center of the catwalk was a rectangular office constructed entirely of glass and black steel. Maeve climbed the stairs. Her legs burned, but the furious hot adrenaline pumping through her veins drowned out the pain. Her footsteps rang loudly against the metal grating. She reached the glass door and pushed it open. The office was stark. A massive teak desk, 2 leather chairs, and a wall of filing cabinets. The air smelled of sharp whiskey and old paper. Roman was sitting behind the desk. He didn't have his coat on. He was wearing a dark dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up past his elbows, revealing forearms thick with muscle and dark ink. The harsh overhead light caught the stark, brutal planes of his face. He was looking down at a thick leather ledger, a pen resting loosely in his hand. He didn't look up when the door opened. He already knew who it was. Maeve walked straight to the desk. She reached into her coat pockets, pulled out the heavy cardboard box of insoles and the white plastic bottle of pills, and slammed them down onto the polished teak wood, right on top of his ledger. The sound cracked like a gunshot in the quiet office. Roman stopped writing. He slowly set the pen down. He looked at the box, then at the bottle, and finally he raised his dark, dead eyes to look at her face. "Stop fixing me," Maeve said, her voice shaking with raw, unfiltered anger. Roman leaned back slowly in his chair. He didn't look angry. He looked profoundly, intensely fascinated. "You're limping," he stated, his voice a low, calm rumble. "I have been limping for 3 years. It's my limp. It belongs to me." Maeve leaned over the desk, her palms pressing flat against the wood. "You don't get to buy my rent. You don't get to heat my apartment. You don't get to track my medical issues and send your goons to hand me pills in an alley. I am not a stray dog you can leave a bowl of food out for." Roman studied her. He took in the flushed, angry color in her pale cheeks, the wild, exhausted disarray of her hair, the way her chest heaved under the cheap coat. She was practically vibrating with rage. "Your landlord was going to evict you," Roman said, quietly, stating a logistical fact. "Then I would have been evicted," Maeve shouted, the sound startling her. "I would have figured it out. I always figure it out. But now I'm just sitting in a warm room, waiting for the bill to arrive, because men like you don't do things for free." "I haven't asked you for a single thing," Roman replied softly. "Then why?" she demanded, her voice cracking the exhaustion, finally bleeding through the anger. "Why are you doing this?" Roman stood up. He moved with a sudden predatory grace, stepping around the massive desk. Maeve instinctively took a step back, but her shoulders hit the heavy glass wall of the office. She was trapped. Roman stopped right in front of her. He was so close, she could see the faint, silvery scar running through his left eyebrow. The air between them suddenly felt thick heavy with an electric, dangerous tension. "Because," Roman murmured, his voice dropping to a harsh, private whisper, "when I walked into that diner covered in blood with men ready to kill for me, you didn't even look at my face. You looked at the clock." He reached out his hand, hovering mere inches from her cheek. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the heat radiating from his knuckles. "You walked right past me, Maeve," he said, his eyes locking onto hers, dark and bottomless. "I just wanted to see what it would take to make you stop and look at me." The absurdity hit her like a physical blow. Maeve let out a rattling breath, dangerously close to a dry heave. The glass wall behind her was freezing cold, seeping through her thin coat, but the front of her body was burning. Roman was a furnace of dark fabric and suppressed violence. He stood so close the scent of his skin, sharp cedar whiskey, and the metallic tang of cold air completely filled her lungs. She traced the silvery scar running through his eyebrow, the unforgiving line of his jaw. He wasn't a fantasy. He was a killer who dismantled lives, and he had just admitted to dismantling hers out of sheer ego. "You're out of your mind," Maeve whispered. The anger in her voice cracked into hollow exhaustion. Roman didn't flinch. His hand, hovering inches from her face, closed the distance. Maeve's body went rigid. Every survival instinct screamed at her to run. But she was pinned between the glass and the apex predator of the city. He didn't grab her throat. Instead, the rough pad of his thumb brushed lightly against the dark skin beneath her left eye. The touch was agonizingly gentle, a man handling glass he expected to shatter. His knuckles were covered in fresh scabs, but his thumb was a warm, heavy weight against her freezing skin. Maeve squeezed her eyes shut. A traitorous shiver wrecked her frame. She had been cold for 3 years, untouched, unseen, a ghost haunting the graveyard shift. The sudden intense focus of another human being felt like a narcotic slipping into her bloodstream. "You're bleeding yourself dry," Roman murmured. "For what, a landlord who hates you? A boss who steals your wages? For me," Maeve choked out. She opened her eyes, forcing herself to hold his stare. "Because if I pay for my own misery, it belongs to me. You don't get to buy my debt just because you want a new pet." Roman left his hand resting flat against her cheek. "I don't want a pet." "Then what do you want?" she challenged, stripping away the deadpan armor she wore at the diner. "You want me to be grateful. Thank you, Mr. Rossi, for the heated apartment. Thank you for terrifying everyone in my neighborhood so thoroughly they won't even look me in the eye." Roman's jaw tightened. He solved problems with cash or bullets in the dark. He had applied his usual tools to the jagged edges of Maeve's life, and she was bleeding on him for it. He slowly pulled his hand back. The sudden absence of his body heat was a sharp shock to her system. "You didn't look at me," he repeated, his voice stripped of its demanding edge. "I walked into a room bleeding, and you looked at a clock. I needed to know why." "Because it was 2 a.m, Maeve said flatly, "and my feet hurt." Roman stared at her. For 10 long seconds, the only sound was the distant hum of industrial heaters. Then Roman laughed. It was a dark, rusty noise, scraping against his throat. He shook his head at his own sheer stupidity. He had thrown thousands of dollars at a girl who only wanted to sit down. He turned back to his desk, looking at the cardboard box and the plastic bottle. "I didn't send them to insult you," he said, his back to her. He picked up the bottle. "I sent them because I watched you limp for 3 hours, and I couldn't stop looking at it." He turned and held the bottle out. "Take them back, or throw them in the river. Your choice. But if you walk out right now, I won't send Leo again. I won't come to the diner. You can have your quiet back." Maeve looked at the plastic bottle. She looked at his heavily corded forearms. She could walk away. She could go back to the agonizing shifts and the constant terror of the first of the month. Her right big toe throbbed a sharp, stabbing reminder of reality. Slowly her worn shoe squeaked against the hardwood floor. She stepped away from the glass, walking up to the desk. Her pale, trembling fingers brushed deliberately against his warm knuckles as she took the plastic container. She picked up the cardboard box with her other hand. "I'm keeping the heated apartment," Maeve said, her voice dropping into a cynical, pragmatic resignation. "Henderson is a slumlord. He owes me 6 months of decent water pressure." Roman's dead eyes fractured. A microscopic, dangerous light sparked in the dark irises. He killed a smirk before it formed. "Noted. But I pay for my own coffee," she added, shoving the items into her pockets. "And you don't send muscle to ambush me in alleys. If you want to give me something, hand it to me yourself." "Is that an invitation to the diner, Maeve? It's a boundary, Roman. I don't do charity." She turned her collar up. She walked past him, her shoulder brushing heavily against his side. The contact was solid. Real. She opened the heavy glass door, its hinges groaning. "Leo will drive you home," Roman called out. Maeve didn't stop walking. Her boots clanged against the metal grating. "I'll take the bus," she yelled back. Roman stood in the doorway, watching her exhausted figure disappear into the cavernous darkness. The air still smelled faintly of bleach and fried grease. He leaned against the doorframe, slipping his hands into his pockets. He had an empire to run, a war to finish, and politicians to bribe. But listening to the heavy thud of the pedestrian door closing, Roman Rossi realized his entire focus was on a 24-year-old waitress waiting for a bus in the freezing October wind. He didn't own her. He couldn't buy her. And for the first time in his life, he was perfectly fine with waiting in line.